When you think about the Electric Light Orchestra, right, or ELO, you think of this band that sold over 50 million records by, well, basically sounding like a room full of musical scientists in tuxedos.
Oh, totally. Yeah, it's very polished.
Right. When you listen to their work, you hear these sweeping strings, these flawless vocal harmonies, and just this massive stadium-filling sound that feels, it feels entirely mathematical.
It does. It feels deliberate.
Exactly. It feels inevitable, like the music was executed with absolute pristine perfection from the very first note. But if you were to actually pull back the curtain on the recording of their platinum album, Eldorado, you would not find scientists at all.
No, not even close.
No, you would find drum kits covered in literal garbage, you'd find record executives storming out of the room in absolute disgust, and a lead singer mumbling just total nonsense into a microphone.
Right, which completely shatters that whole illusion of the pristine artistic process.
It really does.
But as we're going to see today, that mess, it isn't a failure of the process. In a lot of ways, it actually is the process.
Yeah. Well, welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we are stepping right into the middle of that exact kind of chaos. We are looking at the recording sessions for Eldorado, which took place in February of 1974.
Yeah, a really pivotal moment for them.
Definitely. And our guide for this is an excerpt from a memoir called There Ain't No Rules in Rock and Roll. It's by a recording engineer named Kenny Denton.
Which is such a perfect case study, by the way, if you've ever wondered how the sausage is actually made at the highest levels of the creative industry.
Well, for sure. So the mission for our deep dive today is to explore how massive creative friction, completely bizarre studio techniques, and clashing egos somehow managed to forge a masterpiece.
It's a wild ride.
It really is.
Yeah.
Okay, let's unpack this. How do you go from a room full of frustrated musicians and what people in the room literally called a crude demo to a legendary pop record?
Right?
Because to understand the bizarre symphonic sounds they ultimately created, we first have to look at the incredibly awkward dynamic in the recording studio on literally day one.
Yeah, the vibes were not good.
They were terrible. Before they even plugged in a cable, the tension in the room was just suffocating.
Well, let's set the scene a little bit. It's February 1974. Jet Records has booked studio time for ELO to lay down the fundamental tracks for their new album.
So we're talking drums, bass, guitars, piano, the basics.
Exactly, the core band. But their usual engineer, a guy named Dick Plant, he's tied up with another commitment.
Right.
So a studio manager named Louis Ellman, he taps our author, Kenny Denton, to basically step in and start the process.
And Kenny is actively trying to avoid this assignment.
He really doesn't want to be there.
No. He protests immediately because, well, he's getting married. He's supposed to go on his honeymoon on February 16th.
Talk about bad timing.
Right. But he's essentially told to just deal with it, and that Dick Plant will take over eventually. So Kenny walks into this incredibly high-stakes environment with his bags practically packed for his honeymoon, already completely resenting being there.
Yeah, and waiting for him in the studio is the band. You've got Bevan on drums, Michael de Albuquerque on bass, Richard Tandy on keyboards, and of course, Jeff Lynne.
A mastermind.
Right. Jeff is the frontman, the primary songwriter, handling guitar, piano, and vocals. And as Kenny explicitly notes in his memoir, Jeff brought a very fair share of ego into the room.
Which, the dynamic just sounds awful. Kenny writes that Jeff would probably be the first to admit he was difficult to work with, and Kenny would certainly be the second to admit it.
Yeah, they did not click.
Not at all. The rest of the band was apparently pretty easygoing, but Kenny found Jeff incredibly challenging to connect with. And look, I get it. Jeff had a deep, established rapport with Dick Plant, their usual guy. Stepping into that void, it feels less like being a substitute teacher and more like being a substitute surgeon.
Oh, that's a great way to put it.
Right. You're walking into an operating room where the lead doctor is famous, he's eccentric, he's mid-procedure, and he actively resents that you are the one holding the scalpel.
What's fascinating here is the psychological weight of unearned trust in a creative space.
Okay, say more about that.
Well, a recording studio operates like a microscope, right? Every single mistake you make, every half-baked or just wild idea you want to try, it's amplified and exposed to everyone in the room.
Yeah, there's no hiding.
Exactly. When you have an established engineer, there's a safety net. They know how to translate your weird requests without judging you. You can actually be vulnerable.
But with Kenny Denton, a guy who is literally tapping his watch waiting for his honeymoon, that safety net just vanishes. The trust isn't there.
Right. And without trust, you really can't have a smooth, collaborative flow. Every single experimental choice becomes this massive battle of wills. And that initial friction, it sets the stage for everything that follows. They weren't coasting on good vibes at all. They were aggressively battling their way toward a sound.
And that battle started literally on day one, with the actual physical dismantling of the drum kit.
Yeah, the drum sound was a whole ordeal.
Because day one of the Eldorado sessions was dedicated entirely to the drums. And the methods Kenny describes are just wild.
It was a meticulous, highly unusual process. They were taping empty cigarette packets and small pieces of sponge to different areas of this snare drum.
Which is crazy.
And they were wrapping masking tape and heavy articles of clothing around the tom-toms.
Okay, I have a really basic question about this. If you are in $1 million studio trying to make a premium platinum record, why on earth are you wrapping a sweater in literal garbage around the drum kit? Like, what does that actually do to the sound?
Well, it's all about controlling the physics of the instrument.
Okay.
When you hit a drum, you get that initial crack, right? The transient attack. But then the drum shell rings out. The skin vibrates.
Yeah, it had that resonance.
Right, and other drums nearby might even start vibrating sympathetically just from the sound waves. So by heavily taping clothing and sponges to the skins, you completely deaden that resonance. You kill the ringing. The sound becomes this tightly controlled, isolated thud.
Ah, okay. And the crazy thing is, it worked. At first, anyway. Bevan, the drummer, absolutely loved the resulting sound. They had this punchy, completely isolated drum tone, and the room agreed it sounded great.
But then, of course, Jeff Lynne intervenes.
Of course he does.
And this is where the artistic vision violently clashes with standard engineering practices.
Because Jeff insists on a completely different microphone setup. He demands that the overhead microphones, the ones that capture the overall sound of the kit, be placed around 4 feet away.
Yeah, pushed way back.
And then he records a stereo track, doubling up the drum track. Now, here's where it gets really interesting, because the result of that mic placement was this distant, ambient drum sound that completely ruined the isolated thud they had just spent all day building.
They undid their own work.
Kenny Denton and the crew absolutely hated it, but Jeff forced it through anyway. He forced this distant, ambient technique onto every single track. And I am genuinely struggling to understand the logic here. Why would you spend hours meticulously dampening a drum with clothing to remove all the extra noise, only to intentionally capture a muddy, ambient sound?
It seems totally counterintuitive. But to understand that, we need to break down what an ambient mic actually does.
Okay.
When you pull a microphone 4 feet back from an instrument, you are no longer just recording the drum, you are recording the room.
Oh, the actual physical space.
Exactly. The microphone is capturing the sound waves traveling through the air, bouncing off the wooden walls, the ceiling, the floor, before finally hitting the mic capsule. That is natural reverb.
Gotcha.
And doubling up, which is where you play the exact same drum part twice and layer the 2 recordings on top of each other, that creates tiny microscopic imperfections in timing that make the final sound feel really thick and heavy.
So it's just this massive contradiction. Taping cigarette packets to the drums is like, I don't know, it's like violently muting the strings on a piano. You want total clinical control, but then pulling the mics back and doubling the track introduces all this atmospheric chaos right back into the mix.
That contradiction is the exact dividing line between technical perfection and artistic texture.
Oh, that's interesting.
Think about it from an audio engineer's perspective. Kenny Denton wants clarity. He wants a sound that is clean, punchy, and easily manageable when he has to mix all the other instruments later.
Right, because his job is to make it sound good, technically.
Exactly. Technical perfection is about the math adding up perfectly.
But Jeff Lynne isn't doing math.
No, Jeff Lynne is chasing a feeling. By deadening the drums, he controls the initial attack. But by capturing the room reflections from 4 feet away, he captures space. He wants the drums to sound slightly alien, a little distant, and very atmospheric. It perfectly illustrates how true visionaries often have to fight their own technical team to capture a texture that currently only exists in their own head.
And that search for raw texture, it didn't stop at the instruments. He applied this exact same chaotic philosophy to his vocals, which confused the room even more.
Oh yeah, we have to talk about the guide vocals.
Please.
So during the early tracking stages, a singer will lay down what's called a guide vocal. It's essentially a placeholder track to map out the structure of the song so the band knows, where the chorus is or where the bridge is.
Just to keep everyone on the same page.
Right. But Jeff didn't just sing rough drafts of lyrics.
No, he essentially mumbled. Like he would sing these slurred, nonsensical phrases with just the occasional, completely sporadic actual word thrown in.
It's so strange.
It is. And to give you an idea of how bare bones this was, the original guide lyric for the chorus of the song Laredo Tornado was simply the phrase, "I'm dying."
Just that one phrase.
Just that phrase, repeated over and over against a slurred melody.
And years later, Kenny Denton actually found a cassette tape of 2 unfinished tracks from these sessions that showcase this perfectly. One was called Indian Queen, and the other was The First Days of September.
And Kenny sent a copy of that tape to Lou Clark.
Right, Lou Clark. He was the famed string arranger for ELO, basically the guy who made them sound like a symphony.
Right, so Kenny asked him why these mumbled tracks never made the album. And honestly, I thought Lou Clark was going to say they were just throwaway garbage, but his response is unbelievable.
It really is. Lou Clark didn't remember Indian Queen, but he distinctly remembered The First Days of September. He pointed out that the structure of that unfinished mumbled track was actually quite similar to ELO's massive hit Can't Get It Out of My Head.
Wow.
But the crucial detail isn't the structure, it's the vocal melody.
Yes. Lou Clark revealed that the slurred, non-lyrical mumbling Jeff was doing on The First Days of September actually became the exact melody that the choir sings on Can't Get It Out of My Head.
It's mind-blowing.
Jeff had literally called Lou Clark a couple of days before the recording session, saying those exact slurred mumbles over the phone, and told him to write that phrasing out as sheet music for the choir.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, it gives us a profound look into the mechanics of songwriting. Melody and emotional texture almost always precede lyrical meaning. The shape of the feeling has to come first.
It makes me think of a painter, right? Like aggressively throwing huge, messy blocks of color onto a canvas. If you walk into the studio at that exact moment, it looks like a disaster.
Oh, completely.
But the painter's just trying to find the emotional weight and the layout of the composition before they ever bother painting the actual subject, like the trees or the people. Jeff is treating his voice strictly as an instrument. He isn't using it for poetry yet. He's using it as a generator for melody.
That's a great analogy. It is a highly vulnerable, really raw stage of creation. And to an outsider, to a professional engineer like Kenny Denton, it just sounds terrible. It sounds unfinished and lazy. But within those slurred phrases was the absolute blueprint for a multi-platinum arrangement.
But those blueprints only look like genius in hindsight, in the moment. Because they sounded so raw and completely unintelligible to the naked ear, they totally alienated the people holding the purse strings.
Right, because you have to put yourself in the room during playback. You have these distant, muddy drums covered in masking tape. You have mumbled, slurred vocals. And crucially, at this stage of the process, Lou Clark hasn't added his exquisite string arrangements yet, and John Richards hasn't added the captivating choral parts.
So it's totally bare.
Exactly. The symphony isn't there. It's just a messy skeleton.
And Kenny Denton explicitly says that without those orchestral elements, the tracks sounded like a collection of crude demos. And this is the exact moment Don Arden, ELO's manager and a major music executive, decides to visit the studio.
Of course. Worst possible timing.
He comes in, sits down, and listens to the playback.
And he expresses his total displeasure and literally walks out of the studio in disgust.
Imagine being the artist in that moment.
Just rude.
You are trying to build a masterpiece, and the guy funding the entire operation walks out because your rough draft sounds too rough.
Yeah.
The pressure on Jeff Lynne must have been astronomical.
It really was. Michael de Albuquerque, the bassist, noted in a retrospective interview that the Eldorado sessions felt like Jeff's earnest, desperate attempt to find a new direction amid intense pressure. And it wasn't just studio pressure either.
No. The source notes there was a highly publicized feud brewing in the music press between Jeff Lynne and Roy Wood. Now, Roy Wood was from the band Wizard and was an ex-member of ELO.
Right.
And to be completely clear, we are not taking sides here. We aren't here to litigate who was right in a 1974 press war. We're just reporting what was happening. But we have to acknowledge it as a massive source of external stress.
Oh, absolutely.
Kenny Denton even notes that reading Jeff's negative comments about Roy in the press made it even harder for him to warm up to Jeff in the room.
So look at the situation. You have a substitute engineer who resents being there. You have an executive who just walked out in disgust. You have a media feud playing out in the papers, and just the immense weight of expectations for the band's new direction.
So what does this all mean? Like, how does that specific psychological pressure affect the actual sonic landscape of the record?
Because I'm trying to imagine what you do next. If I'm under that much pressure, my boss hates the demos and the press is attacking me, my instinct would be to hide.
Yeah, play it safe.
Exactly. I would smooth out the edges and cover all those messy flaws in reverb to make it sound like a normal rock record.
And that is exactly what most artists would do. Reverb is the ultimate acoustic safety net. It blends sounds together and gives them a lush, unified, forgiving space.
Right.
But when Kenny Denton listened to the final mixing technique for the album, he was shocked to find it was incredibly dry.
Okay, what does a dry mix actually mean in this context?
It means there was absolutely no reverb used at all.
No, none. They used some echo on the vocals, which is a distinct repetition of the sound, but no reverb to smooth things out. A dry mix forces the distinct raw textures of every single instrument into the harsh spotlight. There is nowhere to hide.
Wow.
Even after the beautiful strings and choir were finally added, Kenny Denton still felt the album sounded like unfinished demos because the mix was so unnervingly dry.
It is such an ironic choice for ELO. They are known for massive, grand, sweeping orchestral rock. Think of reverb like the dim, flattering lighting in a fancy restaurant. It smooths everything out and makes the room look cohesive and romantic. What Jeff Lynne did with this dry mix was basically turn on all the harsh fluorescent lights at a magic show. He wanted you to see exactly how the trick was being done.
Which is a profoundly bold choice under fire.
Yep.
It connects directly back to that psychological pressure. When you are engaged in a public feud with an ex-bandmate, you feel incredibly exposed, you feel defensive. Some people fold under that. But Jeff doubled down. Choosing a dry mix is essentially a defiant stand. It's an artist saying, look at this. Listen to every raw texture. I have nothing to hide behind studio magic. External pressures forced him to commit entirely to his uncompromising vision rather than appeasing the label.
And despite all of it, the dry mix, the mumbled blueprints, the masking tape, and the disgusted executives, the final product hits the public.
Yeah.
And the narrative flips instantly.
Totally. Eldorado is released in the United States, and it achieves platinum status. It is a massive, undeniable triumph.
And here is the punchline to the whole story. Don Arden, the exact same executive who listened to the early playback and literally left the studio in disgust.
Yep.
Once the album goes platinum, he is suddenly loudly proclaiming to anyone who will listen that the record is a masterpiece.
Oh, of course he is.
Success has many fathers, but a crude demo is an orphan.
It's hilarious, but it perfectly illustrates how outcome-dependent industry feedback can be.
And it wasn't just the executives who came around. Revisiting the album years later, Kenny Denton, the substitute engineer who just wanted to go on his honeymoon, he finally gains a newfound appreciation for what they built in that tense room.
He does.
He listens back and finally hears the remarkable drum sound they created with those cigarette packets and the room reflections. He recognizes the innovative techniques. And in a great moment of humility, he admits that Don Arden and Jeff Lynne were ultimately right.
Yeah, Kenny concedes that his personal friction with Jeff the Ego clashes, the lack of rapport, it's all entirely overshadowed by Jeff's undeniable talent as a producer and songwriter. The ability to create one of the most acclaimed pop recordings in history speaks for itself.
This raises an important question for anyone listening. How often do we unfairly judge a work in progress by the standards of a finished product? Kenny's eventual appreciation proves that the chaotic process wasn't a side effect of the recording. It was the exact ingredient required.
Absolutely.
If it had been a polite, easy, reverb-soaked session, it just wouldn't have been Eldorado.
Exactly. The rough draft isn't a failed version of the final product. It is the emotional blueprint required to build it.
Synthesize this entire journey for you. We started with a session that seemed totally doomed. A resentful substitute engineer, a ticking clock to a honeymoon. Literal garbage masking the drums, slurred vocal tracks, an incredibly dry mix, and an executive walking out in sheer disgust.
This is a total mess.
But by fiercely protecting that raw, uncompromising vision, ELO forged a platinum-selling masterpiece.
It requires a willingness to look foolish, to sound terrible, and to fight for textures that no one else in the room can hear yet.
And that brings us right back to you. When you are deep in the weeds of a messy, frustrating project, whether it's an art piece, a business proposal, or a piece of code, it might just look like a crude demo to everyone else around you. They might not see the vision. But remember, the masterpiece is in the layering. It takes time for the strings and the choir to arrive.
You have to trust the messy blueprint.
Which leaves us with a final thought to mull over. If a creator's messy, totally unintelligible rough drafts like Jeff Lynne's slurred, mumbled vocals are actually where their true genius is hiding, Well, how much of your own unpolished work are you throwing away too soon, simply because you're afraid someone will walk into the room and leave in disgust? Keep the rough drafts. You never know when you'll need them to write a symphony. Until next time, thanks for joining us on The Deep Dive.